The motion before us, the Industrial Revolution beginning in England in the 1760s, is the most consequential economic event since the Neolithic. And the question of why it happened there, then, remains the live question in development economics. At this table, 3 minds, 3 methods. The empiricist, who begins with what we can actually measure, builds carefully from there, and will not let a claim stand that cannot survive contact with the data. The geographer, who thinks through place and particularity, who knows that general theories break against specific landscapes, and who finds the universal by descending into the concrete. The essayist, who watches how ideas move through culture, who sees patterns in behavior that economists miss, and who asks what it means to live inside an explanation without knowing it. What is at stake is not merely historical. 200 million people in sub-Saharan Africa will reach working age in the next 20 years. What we believe about why England industrialized in 1760 shapes what we recommend to Addis Ababa in 2020. 6. If we are wrong about the mechanism, we prescribe the wrong remedy, and the patient notices. The question is causation at civilizational scale, which is to say, the question is what kind of knowledge we can actually have about how economies transform. Empiricist. Why England? Why then?
The question is whether we can distinguish between necessary conditions and sufficient causes when the event happens only once. England in 1760 had coal near the surface, property rights that let you keep what you made, a scientific society that met weekly, and access to colonial markets. We know this. What we do not know is which of these mattered, because we cannot rerun the experiment. Belgium had coal. The Netherlands had property rights. France had the academy. Spain had an empire. None of them industrialized first. The methodological problem: we are reasoning backwards from a single occurrence to a general mechanism. Every feature England possessed before 1760 becomes a candidate explanation after it. This is not history. It is a just-so story with footnotes. Consider energy. England's economy in 1800 commanded roughly 30 gigajoules per capita annually, perhaps 15 times what was available to the average person in Rome at its height, and 5 times what was typical in agricultural societies. That is not in dispute. What remains disputed is whether energy availability was cause or consequence. Did cheap coal permit industrialization, or did industrialization require cheap coal, which England then found ways to extract at scale? The geographical determinist says coal seams near Manchester explain it. The institutionalist says secure property rights explain it. The culturalist says the scientific revolution explains it. Each is pointing at something real. None can show it was decisive because we have no counterfactual. Here is what we actually know. Between 1760 and 1860, British coal extraction increased from roughly 10 million tons to perhaps 80 million, an 8-fold rise in a century. Textile output expanded faster. Cotton cloth production increased 20-fold between 1780 and 1830. Urban population in Britain roughly tripled. Real wages, after a long stagnation, began a sustained rise around 1820 that has not stopped. All of that is measurement. Now the inference. What proportion of this transformation was replicable under different conditions, and what proportion depended on circumstances unique to England in that moment? The policy relevance is immediate. Kenya has property rights on paper. Its 2010 constitution is a modern document. It has coal deposits. It has universities. What it does not have is an industrial revolution. If we do not know which conditions were sufficient in England, we cannot know which are necessary elsewhere. The falsifiable claim, no theory of England's industrialization that relies on factors present in multiple European countries before 1760, can explain why it happened in England first. If property rights or coal or scientific culture were sufficient, they would have been sufficient elsewhere. They were not. Something else was at work, or some specific combination whose mechanism we have not yet identified.
The empiricist is correct that we cannot rerun the experiment, but geography is not an experiment. It is an inheritance. The search for a general law that would apply equally to the Dutch polders or the Spanish plateau is a search for something that does not exist. The question is not why a generic country industrialized, but why this specific damp island did. The answer is not a single factor, but a sequence of contingent solutions to local problems. Consider the iron industry of the Severn Gorge. The problem was not the absence of iron ore, but the absence of a fuel that could smelt it at scale. Charcoal was exhausted. The forests of England could not keep pace with demand. The solution arrived at Coalbrookdale in 1709, when Abraham Darby discovered that coke, coal baked to remove its impurities, could substitute for charcoal in the blast furnace. This was not a theoretical breakthrough. It was a pragmatic response to a regional fuel crisis. For decades, Darby's method remained local knowledge, barely diffused, solving a problem particular to the West Midlands before the wider world understood what had been unlocked. The same dynamic is visible in canal geography. The Bridgewater Canal, completed in 1761, did not appear because of a national plan for transport. It was built for one reason: to get coal from the Duke of Bridgewater's mines in Worsley to the textile mills of Manchester, 7 miles away. It halved the price of coal in the city overnight. This was not grand strategy. It was a rich man solving a supply chain problem. The result, however, was a template that redrew the economic map of the country in a single generation. These events are not abstract. Let us leave Manchester and travel 15 miles northwest to a weaver's cottage outside Bolton around 1785. Let us call him Thomas Grundy. For generations, his family has woven fustian cloth, a mix of linen and cotton. His skill, his hands, his knowledge of the loom, this is the entire basis of his family's capability, to use Sen's term. But the new Arkwright mill a town over, powered by water and soon by steam from Worsley's coal, can produce cloth at a price he cannot match. His children will not learn his trade. They will move to the city to mind the machines that impoverished their father. The Industrial Revolution for Thomas Grundy was not an increase in aggregate output. It was an eviction. What the empiricist's ledger of national statistics misses is this violent, localized rearrangement. The divergence between growing cities and hollowing out villages. It was not a placeless theory of property rights, but the brutal particularity of who owned what, where, that drove the transformation. The question is not what ingredients England possessed, but what specific recipe it stumbled upon in one small corner of the country.
The two positions share an unexamined premise, that industrial transformation arrives only once a society has first assembled the right external scaffolding, whether measurable factors or local accidents, after which ordinary people merely occupy the resulting structure. What the data actually show is the reverse pattern. Millions of households in low-income settings are now reallocating scarce resources toward portable skills and portable capital before those scaffolds exist. Consider the spread of secondary schooling. UNESCO figures indicate that gross enrollment ratios in lower middle-income countries rose from roughly 40% in 1990 to above 70% by the mid-2010s. The increase occurred fastest in places whose formal property registries and energy infrastructure remained patchy. Parents did not wait for reliable courts or coal seams. They paid modest fees, shifted children out of farm work, and accepted short-term income losses because the expected return on literacy and numeracy had already changed. The same households later directed part of that human capital into small-scale trading and repair services rather than waiting for large factories to appear. Remittance data point in the same direction. The World Bank estimates that recorded flows to low and middle-income countries reached approximately $600 billion in 2022. Most of that money does not finance capital-intensive projects. It finances housing upgrades, motorcycle purchases, and further schooling for siblings. Recipients treat the funds as risk capital for incremental diversification rather than as proof that national institutions have already converged. The behavioral signature is therefore not the replication of any single historical configuration, but the repeated decision across unrelated geographies to treat human capital and small liquid assets as the first objects of investment. That pattern undermines the shared premise. If transformation required the prior completion of an English-style checklist, we would observe long plateaus of immobility followed by sudden leaps once the checklist was marked complete. Instead, we observe steady, unspectacular reallocations by households that improve their options even when the surrounding formal economy stays thin. The policy implication is correspondingly modest. Measures that lower the cost of acquiring usable skills or moving modest sums will be adopted faster than measures that first attempt to install the entire historical package. You state that no theory of England's industrialization that relies on factors present in multiple European countries before 1760 can explain why it happened in England first. Yet South Korean households from 1965 onwards sustained gross savings rates approaching 15% of GDP, while rural to urban migration was drawing substantial numbers of workers annually into light export manufacturing before the chaebol financing structures or the heavy and chemical industry drive had consolidated. If the decisive mechanism must be a completed national scaffold rather than prior household reallocation, what distinguishes that sequence from the English case you treat as unreplicable?
The Japanese case does not break my argument, it clarifies it. Household savings in the 1950s occurred inside a political economy, already restructured by occupation authorities who had dissolved the zaibatsu, imposed land reform that redistributed 80% of tenanted acreage by 1950, and stabilized the yen under the Dodge Plan. The households were not operating in an institutional vacuum. They were responding to incentives created by prior, deliberate state action. The overstatement in my opening was treating England as categorically unreplicable. The accurate claim, replication requires identifying which threshold changes unlocked household reallocation, not merely observing that reallocation occurred. The question you should ask yourself: if millions of households in Indonesia and the Philippines exhibit the same savings and education behaviors you describe, yet per capita income growth remains at 3% annually, while South Korea's ran at 6% over a comparable 20-year window, what accounts for the divergence? Household decisions are necessary. Something converts them into sustained output growth. What is it? South Korea's answer, I would suggest, is not household virtue, but the early 1960s reforms under which the Park government nationalized the commercial banks, directed credit toward export industries through the Economic Planning Board, and imposed performance conditions on chaebols that tied subsidy access to foreign exchange earnings. Alexander Gerschenkron called this substitution. Late developers require institutional surrogates that compress what England assembled across a century into a single legislative moment. Household reallocation then accelerates because the threshold has been crossed, not the other way round. So my challenge to you, essayist, is this. Name one case in the post-war record where sustained per capita growth above 5% for 15 consecutive years preceded rather than followed a discrete change in the rules governing factor markets, land, capital, or labor. And I will concede that the household is the engine rather than the fuel. You claim localized displacement explains transformation better than aggregate measures. But if a Blackburn handloom weaver's eviction from the trade was the mechanism, not the consequence, then regions with the highest rates of smallholder dispossession should industrialize fastest. Ireland between 1845 and 1855 saw rural population fall by roughly 2 million through famine and emigration, a more violent displacement than Lancashire ever experienced. Yet Ireland did not industrialize. It emptied. What is the difference between displacement that produces Manchester and displacement that produces Cork?
The empiricist is right to press on this. Displacement alone creates refugees, not a proletariat. The difference between Manchester and Cork is not the trauma of the departure, but the structure of the destination. Consider the journey of Richard Roberts, a Welsh patternmaker who walked to Manchester in 1816. He was not pushed, but pulled. He was pulled by the sheer density of problems to be solved: how to make a better loom, a more precise metal-cutting lathe. He arrived in a city that was less a place than a reaction vessel, concentrating capital, skill, and frustration in an area of a few square miles. The English patent system existed for the whole country, but between 1760 and 1851, a vast share of the crucial inventions came from that one small region. The Irish farmer arriving in Cork found a port optimized for exporting butter and people. Its network pointed out, Manchester's network pointed in, creating a vortex of recombinant innovation. Your institutions, Empiricist, are like the laws of chemistry. They are universal, but the reaction only happens in the test tube. Essayist, your model rests on household reallocation. Let us take it to El Salvador in the 2000s, where the Inter-American Development Bank documented that families receiving transfers from relatives in Los Angeles spent the overwhelming majority on food, clothing, and home improvements. A construction worker in Houston sends his earnings back to San Miguel. His family replaces the tin roof and buys a second-hand pickup truck. These are rational household choices, repeated across hundreds of thousands of families. Why does this vast capital injection produce a consumption economy dependent on dollar remittances, while the Japanese household savings you cited built an export powerhouse? If the behavioral signature is the same, what accounts for the radically different economic structure that emerges on the ground?
The question is good because it forces the distinction between what households choose and what the surrounding economy can absorb. Taiwanese households in the 1960s directed incremental savings into small manufacturers already embedded in procurement chains run by American department stores and Japanese trading companies. Bangladeshi households receiving garment wages today encounter a narrower range of comparable upstream opportunities. So a significant share of funds flows into land purchases, rickshaw fleets, and import-dependent consumer goods that clear locally. The behavioral pattern is therefore not identical once one examines the destination of the funds rather than the decision to save or spend. Yet the same household logic appears in the rapid expansion of South Korean steel and shipbuilding after 1973, where families used rising factory wages to finance sons' apprenticeships in technical colleges oriented toward export contracts rather than domestic craft markets. The difference lies in whether policy had already lowered the cost of reaching foreign customers.
The question beneath the question is whether economic transformation is something a society does or something that happens to it, whether agency lives in deliberate construction or in the friction between what people decide and what the structures around them permit. We are inside this right now. Vietnam is assembling iPhones while Nigeria imports them. Bangladesh quadrupled its garment exports in 20 years, while Pakistan, with similar endowments, did not. Household behavior looks identical across both. The same move toward education, the same appetite for risk. What differs is not the will, but the interface. So, the question for you is this. When Ethiopia announces it will become a manufacturing hub by 2030, or when Lagos plans to be Africa's financial center, are we watching a country build the interface or perform the aspiration? And if we cannot tell the difference from inside, if the rhetoric of the two looks identical until one succeeds and the other does not, what kind of knowledge are we actually producing when we give advice? Empiricist, you have measurement. Geographer, you have the particular. Essayist, you have the behavioral signal. But can any of you tell me how to distinguish, in 226, in real time before the outcome, between a country that is about to transform and a country that is about to spend a decade discovering it was not ready?
Real transformation reveals itself when household spending patterns start tilting toward goods and services whose buyers sit outside the national border. That tilt is visible long before ministries publish 5-year plans. Shipping manifests from South Korea's southeastern coastal counties in the late 1960s show small metalworking shops and family foundries increasing their purchases of precision, cutting tools, and foreign-grade steel, a quiet retooling that preceded the declared heavy industry drive by several years. At the same time, household budget surveys in those same Gyeongsang provinces recorded rising outlays on technical night school courses and second-hand lathes, financed from overtime wages rather than government credit lines. The same surveys in comparable regions of Egypt during the same decade show investment rising, but directed toward urban apartments and license-dependent retail franchises whose returns depend entirely on proximity to state procurement. The distinction is therefore not between ambition and realism in speeches. It is between two observable reallocations, one that treats foreign price signals as the relevant constraint, and one that continues to treat domestic political access as the scarce resource. The first compounds into new export lines, the second compounds into higher local asset prices until the next shock. Think of it less as a difference in aspiration and more as a difference in calibration instrument. One household is tuning its decisions to an external frequency, the other to a locally broadcast signal that can be jammed or retuned by the next administration. No external observer can certify the difference in advance, yet the accounts of what families actually purchase each month already contain the answer.
The essayist looks for the answer in the ledger of household accounts. This is a mistake. A family can reallocate its budget toward a better future in a country that has no intention of building one. The signal is not what is bought, but what is built. Transformation is the physical re-engineering of a place to solve a new class of problem. The performance of aspiration builds monuments, a financial district of empty towers in a city with an unreliable electric grid. True transformation builds connections. It lays the fiber optic cable, grades the farm-to-market road, builds the cold storage warehouse. It is ugly, pragmatic, and brutally selective. It does not serve the whole nation. It serves the supply chain. We are looking for the interface. So let us look. Go to Abidjan, not to the glass towers of Le Plateau, but west, to the industrial alleys of Yopougon. There is a man there, let us call him Yao, who runs a small cashew processing business. For years, his country exported the raw nuts to be processed in Asia. He is trying to do it here. The government's development plan speaks of a new port terminal to be completed in 2030. Yao's problem is more immediate. The unpaved, rutted lane outside his workshop that floods in the rainy season, making it impossible for a container truck to reach his loading dock. The difference between performance and transformation is this. Performance is the minister cutting the ribbon at the port in 6 years. Transformation is when Yao and the 3 workshop owners next to him pool their funds to hire a grader and buy gravel to make their own lane passable next month. And if you were to go there this evening, you would not see him spending his profits on a new motorcycle. You would see him with 2 hired men under a single halogen lamp mixing cement. They are pouring a new reinforced floor for his warehouse, one that can bear the weight of the new shelling machine he has ordered from India. His hands are gray with the work.
The discovery mechanism for what actually drives transformation may be falsifiable after all, but only if we stop looking at the countries that succeeded. Between 1950 and 1980, Argentina's per capita income was roughly 60% of Britain's. It had steel mills in Buenos Aires, a diversified industrial base, literacy rate is above 90%, and universities older than most American ones. By 2020, that ratio had fallen to 35%. This is not stagnation. It is reversal. The country had already industrialized, then spent 70 years discovering it could not stay there. What Argentina lacked was not the initial threshold, but the negative feedback that prevents capture. Industrial policy became a tool for redistributing rents to favored sectors rather than exposing them to competitive pressure. The state oil company, YPF, became the country's largest employer, not because it found more oil, but because it absorbed workers displaced from other industries. The steel sector survived behind tariff walls high enough that domestic manufacturers paid twice the world price for inputs. Every time productivity growth stalled, the response was to increase protection rather than let the inefficient exit. The pattern is now visible in real time. Turkish manufacturing output grew rapidly through the 2000s, but total factor productivity, the measure of whether you are getting better at making things, not merely making more of them, has been essentially flat since 2008. The firms are there. The workers are there. What is missing is the selection pressure that would force the worst performers out and reallocate their resources to better uses. The difference between Lancashire in 1820 and Buenos Aires in 1950 was not the presence of the threshold, but the continued operation of the test. Transformation is not an event. It is a condition that must be maintained against the constant pull of political logic, which always prefers to shelter the existing over the possible. If we cannot yet predict which countries will cross the threshold, we can at least identify which ones, having crossed it, are about to lose it.